Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, with another great guest for you today. Normal housekeeping off the top. Sorry, we got a late start here. We were having some video issues, but I think we sorted it. Housekeeping, man, if you guys didn't catch my interview with Keith Strop, man, Keith was the founder of Normal. This was a great conversation, man. We got to talk about the Vietnam War and the founding of Normal and Hunter Thompson and Hugh Hefner, all kinds of fun stuff. Rescheduling, which is also going to be a big part of this conversation today. I had Luke Mason from Orem Labs out in Colorado, which had to shut down, unfortunately, due to the market conditions. Drew Greco, who's out in Las Vegas or Nevada, somewhere out there. Josh Sweeter from Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs, always a great talk. And, Lester Black, who I think is one of the top journalists in the country right now in terms of cannabis. Coming up, we got on Sunday, I got Joseph Ortiz. I'm not even sure what me and Joseph are going to talk about. We got to catch up here on Saturday, and then we'll figure it out. Then on Tuesday, the 28th, I got Sean Mosley from Arden's Gardens, who's a local grower right down the road here. And then on Thursday, I got AC Moon, who has a wild backstory about cultivation and dealing with the police and the feds. So that'll be a great talk right there. I think that's about it. So my guest today, guys, I hooked up with him on LinkedIn. I saw some of the comments he was making about rescheduling, and I was super interested to have this conversation with him. So he's the owner of the Camden Apothecary Dispensary at Bell Rexall Pharmacy in Camden, New Jersey. He also serves as the president of the New Jersey Pharmacists Association, and he's a member of the New Jersey Cannabis Trade Association on the policy committee, and he's also an original member of the New Jersey Cannabusiness Association. Please welcome Anthony Minniti. Anthony, thanks for being here today, man.
Thanks, Caleb. Great to be here.
Before we do anything serious, Tony, would you give us a 5-minute life story, please?
God, 5 minutes. That's tough. Well, I'm 54 years old, so it might be. We'll try to keep it to 5. I grew up in the city of Camden, where I'm now also a pharmacist, and owned Camden Apothecary and Bell Pharmacy. I went to pharmacy school at a place called the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science in Philadelphia. It was then became University of the Sciences. And now it's been absorbed by St. Joe's, but it's still in existence. I've been a pharmacist basically since I was 14 years old. And I say that because back in 1984, at age 14, I went to work for my grandfather in his pharmacy in Camden, and I've never left. And here we are 40 years later. So I've had the benefit of being able to see a lot of the trends in pharmacy and a lot of trends overall. Part of what I've done is I was involved in politics for about 20 years in my local hometown of Cinnaminson, where I was a township committee person. I served as mayor for 4 one-year terms, and it's really given me a sort of unique insider's perspective to how politics works. And we sort of got into this idea of cannabis when my family and we purchased Bell Rexall Pharmacy back in 1997. I found a bottle that had a label that said tincture of cannabis. And I thought, wow, how crazy is that? This pharmacy was dispensing cannabis back before prohibition. And I saved that bottle of those years. And in 2013, when then Governor Christie was talking about medical marijuana being legalized, I pulled out that bottle and thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to bring this back to the original pharmacy that was dispensing it? And that brought us to where we are today in 2023, where we opened Camden Apothecary at Bell Pharmacy. We're the only pharmacy dispensary hybrid in the nation, and we're also the only facility that was actually dispensing cannabis before and after its prohibition in the late 1930s. So there's a lot of great history there. And all of these different areas that I've been involved with throughout my life have given me a very unique and different perspective on the progress of cannabis and this whole idea of rescheduling.
Excellent. And I'm going to put you in the big box for the rest of this talk, Tony. Would you mind telling us, before we dive into this, would you mind telling us a little bit about your work with the New Jersey Pharmacists Association?
Sure. The New Jersey Pharmacists Association is our professional organization that represents the interests of all pharmacists across the state. Obviously, I'm in community pharmacy, so I'm a little more focused in that direction. And what we work for in New Jersey Pharmacists Association is the preservation of the history of pharmacists and pharmacy in New Jersey, which goes back, well over 150 years. And it also is focused on the professional development of pharmacists and expanding the role of pharmacists and the profession of pharmacy overall in the entire medical field in general. So there's been a lot of advancements over the years in pharmacy. We went from many years ago in the 30s and 40s when my grandfather was practicing, there were no pills, there was no antibiotics. Everything was made by hand, typically from raw materials that were usually botanicals. And of course, back then, cannabis, opium, these were all commonly utilized medication, or commonly utilized ingredients in medications. Then as we hit the 50s and 60s, we started to see the standardization of medication and the advent of big pharma, where actually standardized forms were being prescribed. And as we went into the 70s and the 80s, pharmacists really became, that was the pill counter years, as they would say, where you came in and pharmacists were really just working, filling as many prescriptions. It was count and pour and label, and there wasn't a lot of discretion that went into what a pharmacist did in practice. If a physician came in with, or a patient came in with a prescription, the physician, we filled it, what the physician ordered. As we got into the 90s and the 2000s, we started to see an expanded role for pharmacists, where we started to become more involved in diagnostics, therapeutics, developing drug therapies themselves. And when I was graduating pharmacy school, there was actually a movement where there was this idea that physicians should do all diagnostics and not prescribe, and pharmacists should be the only ones that do prescribing, which is a unique concept, and it's one that we're actually growing closer to every day as pharmacist prescriptive authority continues to expand. And that is sort of where this idea of pharmacists being involved in cannabis really piqued my interest, and I've worked very hard to steer New Jersey pharmacists in that direction of becoming more involved in the medical side and in the medical treatment space utilizing cannabis. What's great about cannabis right now is that as a Schedule I, there is no hierarchy of authority. So you don't have to go to a prescriber or a doctor first and get a prescription and then come to the pharmacist. Really, anybody who has therapeutic knowledge can engage in, quote, prescription of cannabis therapy. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about the cannabis industry as it is now. I mean, sure, the recreational side's terrific, but there are so many options and opportunities for the use of cannabis as a bona fide alternative therapy or treatment to the common big pharma solutions that we see today. And one of the unique aspects of being a pharmacist who also owns a dispensary, and of course they're side by side with each other, is that I'm not fully in one world or the other at this point. So it's not like my my advice and my guidance and my opinions are guided strictly by the financial interest or the professional interest of someone who's 100% in pharma. I'm just as much in pharma as I am in cannabis, and I see areas where they overlap and there's a lot of synergy. And there's times when I can make recommendations to my pharmacy patients where cannabis I feel is more appropriate. For instance, depression, anxiety, sleep. These are all areas where medications like, we'll use a common term like Prozac, that's blanketly used for depression, it's not always the best remedy. often people are on something like Ambien for sleep issues. Well, Ambien's only supposed to be used for like a maximum of 7 to 12 days. People are on Ambien for at times years. That's inappropriate. And a lot of times a cannabis alternative would be more appropriate and beneficial for the patient. But until we owned the dispensary in the it's right next door to the pharmacy, and by next door I mean we have a pharmacy department in the same building, and right next to the pharmacy we have the dispensary, and that keeps us compliant from a regulatory standpoint, both on the cannabis side and from the DEA side. I try to liken this to people who are trying to envision it. When you go to Walmart, there's a pharmacy department, there's a photo department, there's a liquor store. We've sort of duplicated that compliant plan, but instead of one of these other departments, we've chosen a cannabis dispensary to be next to the pharmacy. So now, rather than just saying, well, you should try cannabis, well, now I can actually guide patients in the use of alternative cannabis treatments in real time, because we have the products there. So we can advise them, I can make recommendations, let them try it out, and we have the ability to actually exercise therapeutic options for our patients. So I always sort of put this out there to many who haven't been around quite as long as I have. The whole initial drive for legalization of cannabis started really in California when it was argued that it should be utilized for patients who were in a terminal condition or dying from either cancer or HIV/AIDS at the time, and had pain that was uncontrollable by any of the common remedies that they had available back in the 80s and 90s. Ironically, many of those remedies that were deemed ineffective are the same ones that started the opiate crisis, which makes us, sort of wonder, wow, if we had had cannabis as an option, as opposed to OxyContin and Percocet and some of these others, and we utilized that for pain the way we did for cancer and full-blown AIDS in terminal patients in California back in the 80s and 90s, would we have ever had this epidemic that we're still wrestling with today? So it just gives more credence to the fact that cannabis is, many would call it this magical plant that's been provided to us. And while recreational use is terrific, there's also a lot of bona fide medical options that are available. Now, the challenge that we wrestle with now is for those of us who have been in the fight for legalization for all these years, and we've done so much work in changing hearts and minds and passing referendum throughout all of these different states, we've sort of built this industry, and now here we're on the precipice of wow, cannabis is really going mainstream, but what are the consequences of the direction that we're taking in our zeal to have it mainstream? And that's really what we have to address as an industry now. There's a lot of nuance to very common terms that if you're not involved actively in pharmacy, if you're not involved actively in DEA law and pharmacy law, and if you're not involved in the political process and understanding how the sausage is made, so to speak, you could be an advocate for something that really you don't want. And what I've really tried to do over these last few weeks is call attention to what, ironically, the fine print is with rescheduling versus descheduling. They are very, very different paths that both bring us to legitimacy, but what are the benefits and what are the challenges or problems with each?
Tony, can we put a pin in that? I want to get, that was going to be the big end. And Miggy 420, I see your question. Have you made your comments on rescheduling that yet? And we are getting there. Before we do that, would you mind telling us a little bit about what it's like setting up a cannabis business in New Jersey? Because from what I've heard, it could be pretty tricky down there and expensive.
It is extremely difficult. We started working on this, getting ourselves the process of getting open. Well, we have to start at the top. The first thing you need is money, and there isn't there, because of the current Schedule 1 status. There's no banks that issue loans. You have to fundraise on your own, and that's a lot of money. You need to have professionals in law, professionals in accounting, professionals in HR. You have to have all these different professionals working just to get you through the application process. Our dispensary is opened in a row home that's adjoined to our pharmacy proper, and I can tell you that at the end of the process, after 2 years of nonstop work, getting the application ready, getting the application in, going through the process of local zoning and getting over those hurdles, then getting building approvals, then building your space out, then getting your inventory set up. My sister and I spent over $1 million of our own money. Now, what we did was we were taking profits, obviously, from our pharmacy, and rather than saving it for ourselves, we were taking disbursements and reinvesting all of that back into preparing our dispensary space, which, for those of you who were interested, if you go to camdenapothecary.com, you can get a little bit of a sense through some video presentations that we have of what it looks like, but it resembles a bona fide 1940-ish pharmacy. That was what we did in continuing the pharmacy theme and honoring the history of being the only establishment to have dispensed cannabis before and after its prohibition. Yes, there you go. Our landing page has our second floor flower areas there, but there's 2 floors to it. But yes, it was $1 million in 2 years of nonstop work, and nothing ever happens the first time, and nothing ever happens easily. So you have to have a lot of commitment to working your way through it. And what further complicates it, the process is in New Jersey, and not that I'm critical of the efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the new cannabis market. A lot of times, if you're not a legacy, what we in New Jersey call legacy, that would be somebody who would be a former drug dealer. That's what they would call a legacy applicant, or a minority applicant. It becomes tangentially more difficult to become licensed because you're not prioritized as an applicant, whereas others are ahead of you.
So in New Jersey, the social equity applicants got like priority for licensing off the bat. Is that right? Yeah.
Correct. Yes. In our situation, my sister is our majority shareholder. We are WB. We always have been. So we did fit into the social equity category. But for a WBE, we were like, there's I think 10 tiers of quote priority social equity candidates, and if you're a WBE, that puts you somewhere around 8. So there were 7.
What does that mean? WBE? What does that stand for?
Women's Business Enterprise. It's essentially a category of minority-owned business. I apologize. That's probably
sorry. I don't know all the acronyms here. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah.
So we after a good year of this, we were a good year in the application process. We finally opened. It took us 2 years for build out. So all in all, it was about a 2 to 3 year working through everything to get ourselves open. Opening inventory is probably about $150,000, and you have to typically what the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission wants to see is that you have 6 months of operating budget put away in escrow to get you through that first 6 months. We did have that, so we were off to the races. And I think right now we were just we hit our 6th month on May 8th. We opened up November 8th.
I'm here with Anthony Minniti, guys. Camden Apothecary Dispensary at Bell Rexall Pharmacy. Yeah, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to that rescheduling stuff. I feel like I had a little bit of other stuff that I wanted to ask you before that, and I wanted to ask you about the weed business because you're the only person I've ever talked to that has a pharmacy and a weed company. So I feel like you have this unique perspective, and I'd also like to know about what it takes to run a pharmacy. You said there's all these like a DEA license involved, and I'd really love to know what goes into that because I assume that might even be trickier than running a weed dispensary, if I had to guess.
You have no idea, but and it sort of goes to the perspective that I described before when I said that back when my grandfather was beginning in the 30s, and back when the original owner, Henry Bellitz of Bell Pharmacy, opened, pharmacists practiced with broad latitude. You didn't go to an emergency room if you had a problem. You went to the pharmacy and they administered first aid or whatever. Doctors would oftentimes prescribe, or they would diagnose condition, and they may give some guidance as to what to use. But a lot of times it was the pharmacist that would come up with the remedies. So before we had real pharma and standardized product and drug companies, the pharmacist had terrific latitude to have this specialized practice where they did a lot of the healthcare administration to the communities they served. We noticed this a little bit, how the benefits of this during COVID. Every community is different. In Camden, New Jersey, for those who don't know Camden, New Jersey, I would probably compare us to Detroit, Michigan. We're a little bit smaller, but the demographic and economic makeup is very similar. Well, what works in Camden, New Jersey doesn't work in the very affluent suburbs that lie 8 miles outside of Camden, New Jersey. And what you had in community pharmacy at the time were healthcare hubs, what they would be called today, where the community came to get healthcare that was administered by somebody who knew the community, knew all the different social mores and intricacies of that community they served. My grandfather served the Italian community in South Camden. Henry Bellitz, who owned Bell Pharmacy, served the Jewish population. Now today, we don't have that many pharmacies in urban cities anymore like we used to. And pharmacies become largely homogenized with a lot of the chains taking over everything. And that's a real loss. But that takes us to the challenges of pharmacy today, is that it has been homogenized. And it is a flat formula that goes across. Every CVS is basically the same CVS, and same with Rite Aid and Walgreens and all the big chains. And pharmacy as a profession, at least in the community retail space, has fallen into that. And it all has to do with regulation. Back in the 30s and 40s, when there was very little regulation, there was no Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. There was no DEA. There was no Controlled Substances Act. There was broad latitude for pharmacists to be able to treat as they saw fit based on who they were treating and who was in front of them. Now I can tell you from the pharmacy side, we have zero latitude. A prescriber issues a prescription. We're responsible to ensure that what the prescriber has issued is congruent and compliant with all of the regulations and all of the literature that governs how that drug is prescribed. We have what's called corresponding responsibility with the physician. This is something that was a real hot topic during the OxyContin epidemic, because many pharmacies would just say, hey, not my responsibility. Doctor wrote the prescription, I filled it. That's what a pharmacy is. That's what a pharmacist does. Well, in response to that, that's not allowed anymore. Now, we have to do due diligence to make sure that a patient's not abusing medication, that a patient, if they get a 30-day supply, only gets it every 30 days. That if they've gotten it from us, they can't have gotten it from somewhere else. So with controlled substances, it's a very strict regulatory process, and there's a protocol that we are required to follow as a condition of our being licensed to dispense and handle controlled substances by the DEA. And that's where all of the scheduling conversation comes into. So what cannabis is now, at least for me as a pharmacist, is it harkens back to that older time where I had the ability as a credentialed degree professional to utilize the knowledge I have to ensure positive outcomes for patients who came to see me. And I didn't have to answer to DEA, and I didn't have to answer to a doctor or do what the doctor says. And I didn't have to worry about what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act said. Just to give you an idea of the authority that the FDA has. And let's look back at COVID, okay? Ivermectin, remember, if anybody that tried to use ivermectin or prescribe ivermectin, which is a perfectly safe drug, and it's been used forever, or Zithromax, another one, perfectly safe drug, antibiotic, terrific efficacy, terrific safety profile. If a prescriber dispensed that outside of the FDA guidelines, the hysteria at the time was such that you could lose your license. And a lot of physicians did lose their licenses prescribing ivermectin for COVID treatment. Now,
like off-label prescribing is what you're talking about?
Correct. And that's the term for it. Off-label prescribing is 100% legal. Any physician is allowed to engage in off-label prescribing as long as there is a process that the prescriber has gone through, then you can follow. There's a logic to why they did this. They've looked in literature and they see a benefit. So even though the DEA hasn't formally approved it for that use, you can tell by the product literature that, you know what, I think this is good for treatment of this condition. Now, for some reason, with COVID, I have my own ideas of why that was. They were not allowing that to happen just in that limited instance. But when we talk about the involvement and the incursion of federal agencies and federal authority into an industry, these are the doors that become open when you let the federal government in. And even though what these physicians were doing at the time was 100% legal, it was 100% safe for reasons that I won't get into on this podcast, they were shut down. They were had their licenses taken away. They lost privileges at hospitals. All of these draconian measures because the FDA said no. A federal agency said no.
Just for prescribing ivermectin?
Yes.
Wow. What does ivermectin normally use?
We as pharmacists received letters from the DEA, from our state licensing board, reminding us that ivermectin and Zithromax are not FDA approved for treatment of COVID. Now, again, off-label use, it happens all the time with all these drugs. But we were, in effect, ordered that we had to ensure that if a patient was COVID positive, that ivermectin was not going to them for COVID, that Zithromax was not going to them for COVID. And if there was some sort of proof that we were complicit in getting those drugs to a COVID positive patient outside the FDA's order, we would lose our license. This is what happens when you let the federal government in. And that doesn't exist in the cannabis space. But as we all yearn for cannabis to be mainstream, if it becomes mainstream, if it becomes Schedule III, it opens up I shouldn't even say opens up. It is one domino that once it's toppled will set off a chain reaction of millions of dominoes in countless different directions that you've never anticipated. Because these federal regulations are all tangled, and they entangle each other. And anybody that says that the federal government won't do this, I just gave you the example of when they just did. And it was during COVID. And it wasn't they to this day have not justified their stance and why they did it. And very quietly, you are allowed to use ivermectin and Zithromax for treatment of COVID today. In fact, it's recommended.
Okay, let me slap this up again here. It's Anthony Minniti. All right, Anthony. And I want to read a couple of comments here. I see Miggy here. Shout out to NJ Weed Man, who sells weed in their capital with no license. And
Listen,
then
we all love Ed. I think his name was Ed Forcion. I've followed him for years and years and years. He ran for Senate. He's tried everything. Yes, he has his own dispensary, and I could tell you, I don't know if he was license number one, but if there was one person that deserved it most, it was Mr. Forcion.
Okay. Here he is again talking about, I think, off-label use. Botox has like 10 uses. And, and here's my man, Tom, the ganja delivery guy. It's used for bovine or equine deworming. I think he's talking about ivermectin there.
Yeah, that's not exactly true. Ivermectin is used for worm. It's referred to as an infestation. If you get a tapeworm, for instance, you would use ivermectin. If you got in the South long ago, there were parasitic worms that if you ran around barefoot, they were microscopic and they could absorb in through your foot, and you can get. That's what ivermectin is used for. The veterinary ivermectin is similar, not the same. Should not be used, by the way, for humans, especially because the ivermectin form is safe to use in humans, is very effective to use in humans. Another one was hydroxychloroquine, for instance. Fantastic results with malaria. Fantastic results in the treatment of COVID. We were ordered that it was not to go to anybody who was not currently utilizing hydroxychloroquine for an autoimmune disease like lupus, for treatment for malaria. Those are the only two indications that were FDA approved. If you used it or if you prescribed it or we dispensed it for the treatment of COVID, which again has been found to be incredibly successful, you would lose your license or face discipline and then lose your license. Again, the federal government getting involved.
Yeah, which is weird because it sounds like something that's already being prescribed a lot. Both of those things it seems like they're prescribed fairly regularly, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you can't do that now. That was odd to me, but let's save the rest of that for another time.
Yeah, and now you can again, by the way. And guess what they'll tell you? They never said you couldn't use it. I sat on a continuing education, a pharmacy continuing education course called Myths Surrounding the COVID Pandemic and Vaccine. And if you heard the double talk, everything that they were screaming was listed as a myth, saying the government never said that. I sat through this. It was one of the most shocking things I've ever witnessed. But again, this is what happens when you let the government in. And I'm going to keep saying that because it's all going to become very relevant when we discuss rescheduling.
Yeah, do it. Let's. I think we're there here. That's about all I got on the build up. That was a good build up too. So I think we're there, man. So those were your comments that I saw on LinkedIn that really drew my attention. And like I said, you have this unique perspective where you have the pharmacy and you have the dispensary. And I assume that, I don't really know enough to talk about this, which is why I started reaching out to people who actually read about the shit. And I do have let's see, I got let me pull up the document you sent me there. This is from the U.S. Department of Justice, Drug DEA, Practitioner's Manual. It's an informational outline of the Controlled Substances Act. And let's get into it, Anthony. I'm going to let you take this one away, man.
Sure. Well, let's start with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. That is when the government came in and, a lot of the post-60s hysteria with all the different the drugs, and then the war on drugs began. Of course, the government's got to give a solution. So they came up with the Controlled Substances Act. And what they did was they created a schedule based on typically addictive potential of different substances. And they started at class 5, which used to be something like, cough syrups that had codeine in it, but were still available over the counter would be a class 5. Class 4 would be a substance like the benzodiazepines, Valium, Xanax. Schedule 4 was also, for a time, Tylenol with codeine number 3, all the Tylenol with codeine products. Right now, Tramadol is a Schedule 4 drug. Gabapentin is a pending Schedule 4 drug. Soma, crisaprotol, has been recently rescheduled to either 3 or 4. If we went to Schedule 3, that's where Vicodin, Lortab used to exist. Those have since been moved to Schedule 2 with Percocet. And morphine, also Schedule 2. Ironically, as many don't know, cocaine is not a Schedule 1. It is a Schedule 2 drug. It's very common use as an anesthetic in hospital utilizations. And believe it or not, a pharmacy can actually order and dispense cocaine pursuant to a DEA-registered prescriber's order. And I say prescriber, and you'll hear that throughout, because not only physicians prescribe anymore. You have advanced practice nurses. There's different. The world of prescribers has expanded beyond that of just the typical doctor and MD. So I try to be accurate. I always say prescribers. And then we get to our Schedule 1s, which are deemed to really have no medical benefit and the highest abuse or addictive potential. And that was where you have, LSD. That's where you would have. That's where cannabis, of course, exists. Peyote. Basically, all your drugs of abuse. Methamphetamine is one, although very ironically, Adderall, which is not far off of methamphetamine, is a Schedule 2 drug that's commonly prescribed for children with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder.
And sorry to interrupt you there, but I've always thought that was fucking ridiculous, in my opinion. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I shared that story with you, and I'll share it again now. When we look about the way these drug companies are, Adderall really, it's a combination of 3 salts of amphetamine, and it was originally marketed as a product called Obitrol that was used in the 50s and 60s. It was given to women who didn't want to show weight during the pregnancy. Think about that for a minute.
So they gave women amphetamines while they were pregnant.
Well, they wouldn't gain weight, and that was what the goal of it was. So that was called Obitrol. Now, I was cleaning out my grandfather's pharmacy basement, and I happened upon a case of it. And I remember I found it so odd. I opened it up, and this aroma came out, and I had never smelled that aroma again until the first time I dispensed a prescription for Adderall tablets that even looked exactly the same. It was as if they got the ones that were in that bottle I found back in 1990 and dumped it into another bottle, and they were distributing it. It was chemically the exact same thing. And that was what they did. And when Ritalin, which was methylphenidate, again, Schedule 2 substance, but when Ritalin went generic, that's where Adderall arrived. Because, of course, there's not a lot of money in Ritalin anymore. It's generic. Anybody can make it. So the drug companies have to come up with a new one. And they recycled this Obitrol from the 50s. That was Adderall. There was no generic. And to me, I think that the coming reconciliation of what's been done to the youth of America with Adderall is going to make the opiate crisis look like nothing. The way that you watch these videos about the Sacklers and Greed and everything, and what they did to all these individuals who were in pain, the Adderall situation, I think, is 10 times worse because you're doing it to children. And so much of, I believe, so much of what we see today with violence, with acting out, with gun violence, especially impulsive behavior, these are all, if you read the side effects of this 3 salts of amphetamine, it's like you're reading the manual for why these kids are off the rails. And to a case, you will find out that these children either were given Adderall long-term or are currently on Adderall. It causes changes in the brain chemistry in a forming brain. And I'm stunned that it's been allowed to go on as long as it has, but I'm certain that at some point we're going to figure that out, and everybody's going to talk about Adderall the same way we talked about OxyContin.
I've been doing that for a while now. I'm glad somebody else said it, because it's wild. You know, you're giving these kids 6, 7 years old amphetamines, and then we have all this talk about the safety of cannabis, and it's like, come on, guys. If you're feeding amphetamines to children, I don't even know why we're having this discussion. Honestly.
Well, when I talk about the importance of cannabis and why I believe it's such a great, I don't want to call it a drug, but it's such a great alternative treatment. It's such a great alternative therapy. It's alternative medicine, the same way that acupuncture is and many holistic and herbal treatments are. That's where I like to keep cannabis, because that keeps it pure, that keeps it away from being manipulated into a drug. And just as a point of history, there has been a prescription form of cannabis that was available. It was a product called Marinol that came in a small gel cap back in the 90s. Now, that was a Schedule IV substance. So for those who question what scheduled cannabis is, well, we already had it once, and it wasn't exempt from anything. It was absolutely held to every regulation under the Controlled Substances Act, but it was a Schedule IV substance, which put it where Valium existed. It wasn't very. It was a synthetic derivative of THC, so it wasn't CBD. It wasn't. It wasn't fake. It was really derived from THC. But they, manipulated the molecules a little bit to try to take away any potential for a hallucinogenic effect. But in tampering with the substance, it rendered what made it effective moot. It was supposed to be used for if you had uncontrollable nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy, you were co-prescribed Marinol, because they believed that the way they recognized that cannabis was fantastic at treating nausea, but they didn't want you to smoke it. They had to put it in a pharmaceutical dosage form, and that's what they did with Marinol. But in making it pharmaceutically and FDA approved for a use, they wound up adulterating the substance to a point where it just wasn't effective, and that's why the drug ultimately failed. But little history lesson, there's already, and it's still available, I believe. I don't know of anybody that's ever used it since. But to those who say, we already have rescheduling of cannabis, and it didn't go well. And again, it plays into why I don't want to see that happen again. So that's a brief. So the Controlled Substances Act, again, from the political perspective, this was a law that went through the required process. It went through the congressional House of Representatives, the Senate approval. A bill was formed that created the Controlled Substances Act, and it was signed into law. At the time, I believe it was Nixon who was president. So this is legislation. This is something that exists, that has the full force of law. And a lot of what we're looking at with regard to this, what happens if we reschedule, is all based around what's some discretion that's been exercised by the federal government through the DOJ with cannabis being Schedule I. And to the common person and to most people, because it seems like it makes sense, well, it was 1, that's the worst. Well, now it's 3. That's going to be so much better. How could it not be, right? Wrong. You could not be more wrong. And I'm going to explain that now why.
Yeah. Here we go. Let me slap your logo up there one more time. Anthony Minniti here, Camden Apothecary Dispensary at Bell Rexall Pharmacy, Camden, New Jersey. Thanks again for being here, Anthony. Yeah, take it away. Yeah,
a Schedule I substance has basically one regulation. It's prohibited federally. That's it. they actually declare that it has no medical value. So in those two statements, having something as Schedule 1 means if it has no medical value, we don't have to worry about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Once something is deemed to have medical value, that will bring us to the rescheduling conversation in a second. But once it's deemed a medicine, it must go through the FDA process. That's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed to ensure purity of substances, that it was to end the snake oil salesmen, the traveling, fraudsters. That's what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was created to do, is to protect the public by saying, if you are going to market a product for a medically recognized condition as a drug, it must go through this process where we've deemed that your claims about this drug are true. And part of that process is creating all of that data that you see when you get any sort of medication. It comes with a package insert that looks like a little square, but when you open it, it opens up like this, and everything is in there: how the drug is metabolized, how it's metabolized in different individuals, how different drugs may affect your body's metabolism, all the side effects that were observed, drug interactions. All of this goes into it, and this process takes 7 to 12 to 15 to 20 years to accomplish if something is deemed to have medical use and is to be marketed as a drug. You can't make a claim, and like we do with cannabis right now, they say, oh, you take an indica for sleep. If it's declared a drug and it's declared to have a medical value, you can't say that anymore. You can't say that until the FDA approves it to be said. Then you can say it. But you're only going to be able to say it in the context of the doctor, patient, pharmacist ecosystem. Because if something is declared to have medical use, most times, and I should basically say this, no, all times, it starts off as a prescription. And maybe after many, many, many years where efficacy and safety has been determined, they will take it off of a prescription-only product and allow it to become an over-the-counter product. For instance, Claritin, you see those commercials. Flonase. These were drugs that went through the FDA process. They were approved. They were prescription only for many, many, many years, probably 10, 12, 15 years. They were prescription only. Now, oddly, as soon as they're generically available and very inexpensive by prescription only, suddenly they will go through the process with the FDA, which is another process, to take it off of what they would call a legend. A legend is any prescription drug, a drug that requires a prescription but isn't a controlled substance. They refer to as legend or RX only. But you can go through the FDA process and have it declared, well, there's so much data on this, it's almost like a song that becomes part of the public domain. Then we can let people buy it over the counter. Ironically, Sudafed was like that until they restricted it under the Methamphetamine Control Act. Then it was 2002, 2004, somewhere in there. Now there's a whole lot of stuff you have to fill out to do that, to dispense Sudafed, or you have to get it by prescription only. But so why is this important with cannabis? Well, it's important with cannabis because if we reschedule cannabis and we take what the Biden administration Health and Human Services Department has said, which they've declared that it does have medical benefit, that triggers a process. And that process means if it's going to be deemed a medicine or a drug that has medical benefit, and it's going to be used to treat in the traditional medical ecosystem, it has to go through the FDA process. There's no other way around it. You're not going to be able to go into a dispensary and buy Sleepy Time gummies any longer. It's going to have to be, they're going to have to take whatever that sleepy time gummy is, they're going to have to go through the drug approval process, which means randomized patient studies, placebo, they call them randomized placebo-controlled studies. You're going to have to determine what the dose is, the acceptable dose for pediatrics. Can pediatrics take it? For the elderly, it's going to have to be go through a process where it's tested against all these other drugs to see how they interact, and will this sleep time gummy cause your heart medication to be more or less effective. That's what happens if cannabis is declared to have a medical use and a medical purpose and to be a medical drug. It will be prescription only. That would be the best case scenario. That would put it as a legend drug where you could just go, like you went and got Claritin from your physician, you could go and you would now get cannabis from your prescriber. Not to be able to get it at a dispensary.
What if people don't have a physician?
Well, I would say prescriber at that point in time, but you can't just walk off the street and buy it. Again, that was the medicine of my grandfather's age. Before we got into the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, before we got into the Controlled Substances Act, you could just come in and you would say, child has cough. In fact, I've got labels. I'll share them with you offline and you can look at them what you will. We used to dispense something called brown mixture. You know what brown mixture was? Opium. Opium in a sugar syrup base that was used for cough. There was a formulation called paregoric that was used for severe nausea. No prescription. It was morphine mixed with a alcoholized, it was an elixir, and they actually had to start adding camphor to it, which is what you rub on that makes your skin burn. They had to add camphor to it to stop people from drinking the whole thing because it was morphine. So that was the old Wild West sort of days. Then we moved in. Now, of course, you can't do that anymore, but that's how pharmacy used to be practiced. So in some ways, it's better that we do have the FDA and we have these protections. In some ways, it isn't so great. But as we move on to the rescheduling process, if it is rescheduled from 1 to 3, it goes from no regulation. It's not a drug. So really, there couldn't be any regulation. You couldn't require a prescription because it's not a drug. Now it is a drug. Now it is highly regulated. And the difference between what President Obama did, which wasn't decriminalizing or anything else, his administration defunded the budget of federal cannabis enforcement to the states. So the DEA had no funding to go after cannabis users in states anymore. He defunded that. So it ceased to exist. And what the Department of Justice did at that time, and I will give President Obama credit for this, he found a smart way to not enforce the federal prohibition. That doesn't exist with Schedule 3. Schedule 3 is highly regulated, and there is no defunding the DEA, so it can't enforce Schedule 3 regulations. Now, Schedule 1, since it's not a drug, since it can't be prescribed and it can't be dispensed, I don't have to answer to the DEA because there's nothing to answer to. It's just prohibited. If you're utilizing a C1 substance like cannabis has been, the DEA, of course, can say, you're violating the DEA, you're violating the Controlled Substances Act, and that could jeopardize your federal licensing if you're a physician, if you're a pharmacist, if you have any sort of federal license. And this happened in Georgia. In Georgia, a good colleague of mine named Blair Curlis did some really inventive things in Georgia, and Georgia came up. They passed, and their Board of Pharmacy authorized pharmacies to dispense a narrow range of tincture-based cannabis products across the counter of a pharmacy. And they held
Botanical Sciences, I think, was doing that, right? In there?
Excuse me?
Botanical Sciences. That was one of the medical companies down there in Georgia.
They may have. I'm more familiar with the pharmacist than the companies.
Okay,
but as soon as that happened, they all got a love letter from the DEA saying, your pharmacies and you first of all, you're a DEA registrant because you dispense controlled substances pursuant to the Controlled Substances Act. So you're registered, you're a DEA registrant. You administer Medicaid, Medicare, federal and a federal/state program. We're formally noticing you that if you do this or if you continue, you put all these federal programs at risk because you're operating in violation of the Controlled Substances Act. Now, this is where those who are for rescheduling will say, well, but if it's Schedule 3, then we don't have to worry about that. No, you have to worry more about it now. Because if it's Schedule 3, and I would encourage you, Caleb, to share that DEA registration manual. To be able to handle a controlled substance or be involved in the chain of custody or supply chain with any controlled substance.
Right here.
Yeah, any controlled substance, you have to register for a DEA license. Now, registering for a DEA license doesn't mean you're going to get a DEA license. That means you apply. And when you apply, you have to go through a background check that includes fingerprinting, criminal record, the whole 9 yards. If you have any sort of drug conviction, you will not get a DEA license. If you have any sort of felony, you will not get a DEA license. If you have a DUI or a driving under the influence, you will not get a DEA license. You may continue to appeal and fight and whatever, and maybe eventually you may get a DEA license, but just because you apply for one doesn't mean you get it. That starts a process, and every time the DEA license isn't forever, you have to continue to reapply every so many years, and every time you reapply, you've got to go through this background process again to make sure none of the disqualifying factors occurred between the time when you were last issued and the time that you're needing it reissued. And typically that's about 3 or 4 years. So, wow. Yeah, so you've gotten your DEA license. Congratulations. Now what? They send you that manual. You had better read every page of those 56 pages and know it backward and forward, because you are expected to comply to the letter with everything that's in that DEA manual. If you do not, you will get a letter from the DEA advising you that they're aware of a violation, that there's concern about a violation. If it's severe enough, they can suspend your DEA license until pending an investigation. They could revoke your DEA license just like that. That's what typically they don't just revoke. They will give you a warning first, as in the situation with the Georgia pharmacists. They give you an opportunity to comply. So I would say it's coercion or threatening, but that's the nature of it. But when you accept that license, that's a privilege, not a right. You know, like they say about driving. You know, you don't have a right to have a DEA license just because you want to be in the pharmacy business or just because you want to handle cannabis or a controlled substance. So every single person, every single company must, in fact, is required to apply for and obtain a DEA license before they can do anything with the handling of a Schedule 3 substance. That's the law. That's what's in the Controlled Substances Act. That's what's in that manual. And that's what no rule, that's what the government would never, that's not what, well, it's states' rights. None of that applies. You can't handle that product unless you have a DEA license. And every link in the chain is bound by the same thing. So one of the things I hear is, oh, but they'll just not enforce it. No. Whereas President Obama defunded that cannabis enforcement arm in the states.
Sean, can I stop you? Can I stop you for a second? He said they didn't defund it. They just said they can't expand money to enforce it. I wanted to slap
Yeah. I apologize. I'm using a term of sort of art, but yeah, I call it defunding. It's a broader term. They didn't just cut it away. Yes, they didn't expand the allocation. And of course, every administration has an attorney general, and attorney generals have broad discretion on what can be enforced and what can be enforced. But that's because dispensaries in states don't have DEA licenses. There is no DEA license. So none of us have to worry about jeopardizing our license because there's no federal regulation. The only regulation is if you cross state lines with it, the federal government can become involved. You can't claim it on your federal income tax because cannabis money is technically illegal money. But once you have a DEA license, I have a license, but you know who else has a license? The wholesaler who provides the drugs to me. They have a DEA license. So what the federal government does is irrelevant. Enforcement is going to happen at the top of the chain. The manufacturers, the growers, they're going to have DEA licenses. So if the idea is, well, they can sell, if you don't have DEA, no, they're not going to order prescription, to order any Schedule 2 through 5 substance, I have to demonstrate proof of an active eligible DEA license. That must be verified by the wholesaler who sends us the medication, who has a DEA license, who gets their drugs from a drug company who has a DEA license. So the supply chain's the enforcement, not the FBI, not the federal government, nobody's watching to see if, am I driving across the Ben Franklin Bridge into Pennsylvania with cannabis in my pocket and somebody pulls. No, the supply chain enforces it. They enforce it because they don't want to lose their DEA license, and they're going to comply. Whether you comply or not, they're gonna. And if they comply, you can't comply unless you're compliant and unless you're a DEA registrant in good standing. It is the federal seizure of the industry and subordinating it entirely to the DEA under the Controlled Substances Act. Anybody that tells you otherwise is a fool or a liar. And I say that because there's the book. There's the book. Read the manual. Read what it says.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested, guys, I can
naturally all controlled substances, they are prescription only. Of course they are. If Claritin was prescription only and it was an allergy medication, don't you think that a Schedule 3 drug that's been determined to have addictive potential and could be dangerous, and they call it CDSs, controlled dangerous substances, you can only, so how would we get cannabis to patients? Well, recreational's finished because assuming they got a DEA license, which I'd love to see how that would be, but assuming they got one, well, what's the mechanism for you to dispense it? Well, currently, the only people that can dispense a drug pursuant to a prescriber's written order is a pharmacist. All right, and I say this, there's no recreational anabolic steroid establishments. There's no recreational ketamine dispensaries. There's no recreational Suboxone clinics. And I got to tell you something. The penalties for getting caught with a Schedule 3 substance, which also extends to 2 through 4, are extremely severe. You're going to jail if you don't have a prescription for that Schedule 2 through 5 or 2 through 4 substance. You're going to jail. You will never hold a DEA license. And something about that prescription, this isn't the days of when you go get a medical card and it's good for a year or 2 years or whatever. No, there are strict limitations on controlled substances. A prescription for a controlled substance is good for 6 months. A 1 month supply plus 5 refills. And once you hit the 6th month, if you haven't gotten that last refill, doesn't matter. You're not getting it anymore now. And not only do you have the limitations on exactly 6 months After that, you got to go get a new prescription, start the process all over again. Every single 6 months, you must get a new prescription. And if that prescription lapses and you're carrying cannabis 7 months after the 6th, you're going to jail, because that's the law. It's the same as if you got caught with Suboxone. It's the same thing if you got caught with a bag full of anabolic steroids in your gym bag. If you don't have a prescription that's valid at that moment, you're going to jail. It's mishandling, it's possession. It's far more severe than what the states have done with cannabis. Why? Cannabis is just prohibited. It's not regulated. Schedule 3 substances are highly regulated. And there's a law, not a rule, not a, we're going to look the other way. It's the law. Now, one of the novel concepts that I've heard, and I applaud the attorney that brought this up, and it is a good angle. It's, well, but that's, federal government still is only involved in interstate commerce. It's not what happens within a state. So if, let's say California, we'll just use that because that's when everybody argues. If it becomes rescheduled to Schedule 3, and now it needs a prescription, it needs all the things that we've just gone through, like it would be any other drug. California says, you know what? We're not going to enforce it. The federal government can say, okay, how much money do we give you for your state Medicaid program? How many billions of dollars is that? Do you want that billions of dollars? Because if you do, you're going to MF and comply. And if you don't, we're going to yank your federal funding. So go ahead, go off on your own, see what happens. That's what happens when you let the federal government into your industry, okay? When you let the federal government into your state. If you take money from the federal government and think you're going to ignore the rescheduling of something as a Schedule 3, then there's nothing for me to tell you other than you just have to wait and see. Imagine if somebody decided we're not going to enforce Title IX. Okay, that's a controversial topic. State decides we're not enforcing it. We don't care what you say, federal government. States' rights, and by the way, I'm a states' rights guy. I don't believe that we're a country that's a democracy. That's wrong. That's not what we are. We are a constitutional republic of independent states is what we are. What's subordinated the states to the federal government has been taking the federal government money. And there is no way that states as they are now can risk losing or could ever afford to lose the amount of money that comes from the federal government to individual states for roadways, for health programs, for law enforcement, for all these different things. If you think you're going to ignore part, then you're going to see they will pull the funding. Don't want to enforce Title IX? Okay. Department of Education yanks your federal funding. No more school lunches. You want to pay for them on your own. No more school busing. Pay for it on your own. See what happens to your tax rate. That's what happens when you don't comply with the federal government. They will do it. They've done it. And if you think they're not going to do it in this instance, you're a fool. And I will tell you flat out, you are a fool. Because, as Dr. Phil always says, the best indicator of future behavior is past practice. They've done it every step of the way. We've been very fortunate over this time that cannabis has been allowed to do what it's done with, thankfully, the steps that President Obama took that allowed us to get to where we are, that were, to his great credit, President Trump followed that, and same with President Biden. These administrations have followed this non-enforcement sort of gentleman's agreement is what I would call it with the states when it comes to cannabis. They don't have to. A president can come in tomorrow, and I won't say Bernie because I know Bernie wouldn't do it. Honestly, I would say Kamala Harris, if anybody. She could come in tomorrow and she could revert back to her policy of enforcement in California. You know why? That's the law. So, Sure, Trump, Biden, Obama, none of them bother, but that doesn't mean it doesn't still exist, and that doesn't mean it still can't be enforced. So we think it would never happen because we've gotten somewhat complacent, and all these years it hasn't happened, but that doesn't mean it can't. And that's where I say that descheduling is the only real way forward to sort of place cannabis in a tier where there kind of is some regulation from the federal level. Maybe instead of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, now it's alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and firearms. But their activity in the state markets is limited. It's limited until it becomes a federal issue, which means crossing state lines, utilizing the mail. Okay, that's another one people don't think. You utilize the mail, you get mail fraud, that's a federal crime. So, all these different nuances start to blend in. This is what happens when you subordinate your authority to the federal government. And rescheduling is doing that. And to those that think you just, okay, well, they won't enforce. All right, let's go with that. They won't enforce. You know why they're going to enforce eventually? They're going to enforce eventually because the makers of Suboxone and ketamine and anabolic steroids and Tylenol with codeine and this and that and all the other drugs say, whoa, what about us? What about us? I want a ketamine dispensary. I want recreational Suboxone.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, that's ridiculous. And they're going to say, no, it's not. Cannabis is a Schedule III drug. You're saying that cannabis, you can't put cannabis into a Schedule III and say, we're not going to enforce cannabis, but we're going to enforce everywhere else. That's not the way it works, folks. Commutative property of addition, okay? If cannabis is a Schedule III drug, if Schedule III drugs are subject to these regulations, cannabis is subject to those regulations. We learn it in 5th grade. That's what it is. That's what rescheduling means. Not because I'm rooting for that, not because I'm fear-mongering, not because that's what it is. You will only get it after you have a prescription, after you've gone to the pharmacy. And then there's a host of regulations that go along with this. You may not know this. If you get a controlled substance fill anywhere in this nation, any state, every single pharmacy is required to take the information from your prescription, name, date of birth, address, which we have to verify and certify are correct, the medication you got, the brand of the medication you got, the quantity, the directions, the prescriber. We collect that data throughout the day when your prescriptions are being filled. Every day at 12:01 a.m., all that data is uploaded to something called the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. It is a near national database where I can, and this is what I'm required to do as a DEA registrant and as a pharmacist. If somebody comes in with a prescription for controlled substances 2 through 4, the first thing I got to do is go in that monitoring program, pull up your name, look at your drug use history, make a determination on if you're legitimate or an abuser or at risk of being an abuser, because it's all there. All the controlled medications that you've gotten are all in that database. Every dispenser is required to go in there and confirm that you're not getting it too early. So you go and you buy an eighth of Brownie Scout, you knock it out in 24 hours, come back for more. Well, it's going to be a drug now, so there's going to be dosing requirements. You can't take all your Suboxone, a 30-day supply, if that's what they say it's supposed to last, and come back and get it 2 days later. No. That will get reported to the PDMP. I will instantly get a call from the DEA, our field office over here in New Jersey. What's going on? Didn't you check the PDMP? They got a 30-day supply of Suboxone yesterday. Why are they getting a 30-day supply again from you today, 3 days later? You're going to get it on day 29 or 30. That's the law. That's what happens if you reschedule. And I will say it again. It's not fear-mongering. It's not supposition. It's not anything other than read the manual. It's all right there. They tell you don't have to wonder what's going to happen. They tell you what's going to happen. They put it on the internet so you can read it. There was a time it was hard to get that manual. You only got one when you registered, and you had to take good care of it. And every once in a while, you had to check in to make sure there were no updates, that you had to get a new one and request a new one. They'd send you one. Now it's right there online for everybody to see. It's not a question of what if. It's not of we have to look at. Read the manual. It's all in there. It tells you exactly what's going to happen. And anybody that disregards the manual or thinks that it's not going to matter or whatever, start back at the beginning of this discussion that we've had and re-listen to everything that I've said. I've outlined it for you. I've been doing this since I was 14 years old. I am 54 years old. I have seen so many things. I've seen the complete decimation of the once great profession of pharmacy, where we're subjugated to basically becoming insurance processors, tattletales for the DEA, and basically robots that dispense your drugs. You don't need me. You get that, you order it online, it's come in the mail. Well, I don't really have any discretion anymore. I don't want to see that happen to cannabis. We have such a wonderful opportunity. We've earned this industry and this freedom that we have. And the fact that so many in our industry are working so hard for an end that brings about the end and brings about a new era that I've seen. You don't want to see it. I make this joke to those who are of a certain age that maybe remember the movie Terminator. The first Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger was trying to kill, what was Sarah Connor, or whatever her name was. Okay. He comes back in Terminator 2. She freaks out because here he is. He's going to kill her again. And he puts out his hand and says, "Come with me if you want to live." I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger, guys. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Come with me if you want to live. You don't understand. I've lived it. I was on the other side with the machines. I'm sent from your dystopian future because it's my pharmacy present. You don't understand what you're doing. You don't understand the consequences. We still have time. I want you to think about this, Caleb. How quiet has the government been while all this has been going on? You haven't heard anybody objecting, really. Why would they? They're looking at it and saying, wait a minute. So you're telling me if Kamala Harris came out tomorrow and made a big announcement and announced the federal government, we're federalizing the entire cannabis industry. We're rescheduling it as Schedule 3. Here's what's going to happen to everybody. No more rec. We're done playing games with you guys. We're rescheduling it. We're taking over. What do you think the reaction from this industry would be?
Not a great sales pitch there.
Right. But they don't even have to sell it. We're the idiots that are doing it to ourselves. We're clamoring for this. We're celebrating it. We're calling it such a great victory. They're federalizing our industry, folks. They're taking it away from us. We're not even taking it away. We're asking them to give it to them. And why? Because people think that they're going to be able to gain the write-offs of the 280E. Come on. You won't even be in business. You're not going to need tax write-offs. If you're a rec dispensary, you're done. If you're anything other than a pharmacy, you're done. How are you going to have cannabis? Can't be once it's a Schedule 3 drug and it's a drug, it can only come through a doctor and a pharmacy. There's no dispensaries. One of the crazy things I hear is, well, but there's medical cannabis. No, there's not. There's cannabis. We call it medical cannabis for the purposes of fitting into whatever referendum that a state wanted to pretend that it's not real. No, medical cannabis is cannabis. The Controlled Substances Act addresses a substance. There's no medical Suboxone and rec Suboxone, or there's no medical cocaine and rec cocaine. These don't exist. Cocaine is Schedule 2. Okay, cannabis will be Schedule 3. it will be subject to all of this. There is no medical. It's all medical at that point. Quote, medical. It's going to be taken over by Big Pharma. It's going to be taken over by the federal government. They're going to manipulate the plant. Think about what's going to happen with GMOs being introduced into this, because they're going to have to promote. They're going to have to make such vast quantities. You want to know where big tobacco is right now? Licking their chops. Their infrastructure is already in place. Nobody smokes any more tobacco. You don't think they could grow cannabis tomorrow for Pfizer? This is what's happening, folks. It's happening. It's happening right in front of you. They're telling you they're doing it. And because we've worked hard to convince everybody that cannabis was different. It was a great plant and everything, because we know that it is. But we're pushing this too far. There's a time when you stop and you take the victory and you just coast. That's where we are at this point. By trying to legitimize it to the point of a pharmaceutical, it's going to become a pharmaceutical. And then at that point, it's going to become the opposite of everything that we've developed. They're going to ruin it like they did with Marinol. Okay? They're going to ruin it like they did with opium. Okay? All this hydromorphone, oxymorphone, all of these are chemically altered forms of a natural substance where, if probably used properly, would not be as dangerously addictive as it is. Look at fentanyl. Same thing. All of these things are derivatives of a plant, a magical plant. Pharma got a hold of it and they ruined it. And they ruined a lot of people in the process. I don't want to see that happen to us. We've worked too hard. That's where we're heading. So if we want to do this, deschedule. Descheduling, we can work with that, okay? How about this? Whatever happened to the Safe Banking Act? All right, and for all those people who think that there's going to be some sort of grand federal consensus on all of this, they can't even pass the Safe Banking Act. And you know what? You can. See, that's a law. If they pass the Safe Banking Act, we could have banking. Look, the federal government makes laws. That's what they do, right? They make them, the president executes them. They couldn't make a law that says, you know what, cannabis money, we know it's Schedule 1. We're going to leave it Schedule 1, which I think they should. But as far as the money thing goes, look, if the state, I don't want to say like laundering the money through the state, but if the state's willing to vouch or accept that the money's legitimate commerce, you could pass a law that allows it to become federal. You could pass a law that allows you to get your tax breaks or your write-offs. In New Jersey, they've already done that. I mean, I could write it off our state taxes. I mean, it's not a lot. But for a tax write-off, you want to give up your industry for a tax write-off? How much money do you think it is? You spend 30% of it back, maybe. So that's the big expense savings. Look, I don't want to pay taxes any more than anybody else. But I don't want to subordinate our industry to the federal governments for a tax write-off. So descheduling, folks. Deschedule. And I can tell you, I've largely been quiet on this for so many years, and I've been listening to this because I've been waiting for the Safe Banking Act to get passed for several years. And every year I hear the same thing because I know how to listen, and read the tea leaves and what politicians are saying or not saying. And it seems like always seems like it's right there, but somehow it never is. And that's because this is far too contentious of an issue nationally. There isn't a national consensus about how to handle this unless it goes Schedule 3. Once that happens, that's the national consensus. The law is the law. It will follow the law. And it'll be subordinated to the DEA and the federal government. There's no waving that away. No matter how much people want to say you can ignore it, they're not going to ignore it. If they had the idea that they wanted to ignore it and really fix the problem, they would fix the Safe Banking Act, allow the commerce to continue, and you can still keep it locally grown. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't know that the industry really wants to have cannabis flying across state lines and whatever, because I tend to think that when that starts to happen, we start to creep more towards a national cannabis market versus the individualized markets we have now. And also big business is going to get into it. Why wouldn't they?
Already are.
Who's Amazon could carry cannabis? It's a commodity at that point. If we descheduled it and we erased the state lines and we allowed interstate commerce, well, great. Costco, Costco is the biggest buyer of wine in the world. You don't think they can exercise that with cannabis? And then it's not going to be the cannabis that we want. It's not going to be the independent growers because they're not going to be able to survive. It's going to be Monsanto manipulated massive crops like they used to have with tobacco. And the same way they effed up tobacco with a lot of different chemicals and all this other nonsense that was with it. Tobacco at the time of the Indians, and this goes back to my grandfather again, would teach me this, was a magical plant. It was used as medicine. Tobacco was used in religious ceremonies. It was something that was respected. You know what effed up tobacco? Big tobacco. Making it more addictive. Making it, that's what caused all of this.
Spraying pesticides and shit.
Yeah. And we're on the precipice of doing it again. And we're doing it to ourselves. Like, that's just what's so vexing about me. We don't need to make this move. And I think that what people need to do, step back and think and read. And that's all you have to do. There's no fake news involved with the DEA manual. That's the manual. It's not my interpretation of the manual. It's the manual. They give it to you. Read it. It doesn't say anything in there about special waivers. It doesn't say anything about medical versus recreational. It doesn't say anything about a state's ability to, it's actually against federal law. If a state declares something if the federal government declares something Schedule 3, the state can't come in and say, well, we're descheduling it. They're not allowed to do that. The federal government always supersedes the state, and now the state can make it more restrictive in their state if they wanted to. You could say cannabis is federally Schedule 3, but it's Schedule 2 at a state level. That can be done, but you can't do it the other way. And you certainly can't do it where it's decriminalized or where you can just go into a shop and buy it. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. And those in the industry that want to see us fail, they're going to use this as an opening to, like the brown shirts, to go and report us to the DEA if we're not acting in compliance. This is dangerous ground we're on, folks. It is dangerous, dangerous ground. And I'm just hoping, between you and me, intellectually, to me, my political spidey senses tell me this is a desperation move made by a president and a vice president who have a long history of being anti-cannabis and are grasping at anything right now. And they think they can buy our votes by doing us what appears to be a quote-unquote favor. But Caleb, as I told you in our discussion, it was Ronald Reagan who said the scariest word you'll ever hear, and it's not just say no, it's I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. That should frighten anybody. That's what you're hearing right now. We don't need their help. They didn't help us up to this point. We've done just fine. We're where we are because we've earned this. All of us that have stayed in it. The weed man himself, who everybody laughed at when he was running for Senate and getting 2 votes. He has his own dispensary now. We earned this. And I don't want to see it go the way of pharmacy. But goddamn, that's where it's heading. And too many of our own people are driving it in that direction at breakneck speed.
And I got one last question for you here. It's Anthony Minniti here. So it seems like you got the dispensary and you got the pharmacy. It seems like either way this goes, you're going to be all right somehow. So let me ask you, why is this important to you, Anthony?
I loved being a pharmacist. I loved what attracted me to pharmacy. And I sat there and watched over the course of 30 years, watch it be destroyed. And I do well as a pharmacist. I'm not going to make any bones about that. And I do well within doing practice initiatives. We were the first pharmacy in the nation to jump onto a pharmacist model where we would prescribe PrEP to those most at risk. And at the time it was, mostly IV drug abusers, those in high-risk lifestyles, sex trade workers. And the model got national acclaim, and though we never really got to launch it ourselves, it was sort of pulled, and you see that now. You see teleprep, and you see if you watch Comedy Central, you probably see Descovy for PrEP, Truvada, and it's expanded into the HIV space with a lot of injectables. I've always been focused on more of the practice model of the pharmacist. So I would develop a program around a product, but the idea was to almost practice medicine within the confines of what we were allowed to do. That's what I was trained to do. From the time I was younger, I was trained in the art of compounding and the importance of utilizing botanicals as remedies, and how that many times they would replace pharmaceuticals. Just to give you an idea, my grandfather passed away when he was 3 months short of 100 years old. Never took a prescription drug in his life despite being a pharmacist. I mean, how crazy is that? He had bladder cancer. We found out that's eventually why he passed on. He took no treatment for it outside of his regular herbal remedies that he took for several years. Nobody could understand how he was still living. That's how strongly he felt about alternative remedies, the traditional medicine and traditional remedies. When I got into the cannabis space, I always had this idea. Initially, it was, well, it belongs in a pharmacy. So why wouldn't a pharmacist be dispensing it? I pulled that bottle out that I found, back in 1997. Tincture of cannabis was dispensed at this pharmacy. And I thought, wow, what a great idea to bring that back. But the more and more I learned of, and I'm going to call this a profession, because it is. There's things that my bud tenders and my director of operations, who's been in cannabis from the days when Mary Jane's Collective first opened in California, in North Hollywood, he knows nuances and things that I'm just learning. So I do believe that what we have is a profession. I don't think that this is just an industry. I think it's a profession. I'm in love with this profession and everything about it, because it reminds me of everything I loved about pharmacy. And I don't want to see that lost. I've watched it once. And I'll be goddamned if I'm going to sit back and watch it happen again like I did the first time. And I wish somebody, back then there wasn't a social media. This wouldn't occur. Me talking to people across the country or on LinkedIn, your voice, you yelled at the sky and nobody could hear you back then. We have different tools now. And that's why I'm here to warn everybody. We have something special. Is it perfect? Is anything perfect? But I'll tell you what, it's pretty goddamn good. And what we're asking for, I've been to that place, and I don't want to see us go there. And I don't want 20 years from now, someone to say, God, if only I knew, if only we could go back and do it a different way, because it'll be too late. Once it's in place, that's it. You're not getting rid of it. I mean, yes, moving within the schedules, that's a rule that falls under FDA authority, okay? But you can't change what those schedules mean. You can't change the requirements. You can't wave them away. Sure, it's Schedule 1 now. We can move it to Schedule 3. Yes, the DEA has the authority to do that under its rulemaking, absolutely. But you can't make Schedule 3 recreational. Can't. It's a law. So people don't understand they don't understand the process. How a bill becomes a law. What happens with that? We're not really taught that in school anymore like we used to. Or if you were my age, when I was a kid, they had something called Schoolhouse Rock, and there was a jingle called "I'm Just a Bill." But that's where you don't understand the political process. You can't just wave away a law. It's a law. And you can revoke it. There's a process for that too. But this idea that somehow cannabis is magically not going to be held to all the standards, you're wrong. You could not be more wrong. You are completely wrong. And I've explained the difference between Schedule 1 and the difference between Schedule 3. No regulations, not a drug. Schedule 1. Schedule 3 is a drug, very regulated. Those are differences beyond anything words can explain. And, you know, I've lived it. I'm telling you, you don't want to live it. So understand what you're advocating for. And look, if you still want to believe that that's the way you want to go, if you think that I'm crazy, you think that I'm wrong, go ahead. I mean, then that's your, but you've been told. You've been told. Somebody explained this to you and did it in the best, because I don't consider myself the smartest guy. I think I try to talk in pretty plain language. I mean, so I'm not using crazy, you know, pharmacy terms or medical terms or even political terms or anything else. I'm just an average guy, you know, who's seen it. And I'm trying to explain it in the way that I think communicates that best. You know, I think that if we look at the deschedule versus reschedule, my hope is this was like a trial balloon that they floated up there to see how it went, and ultimately it would result in deschedule. You know, one of the things I hear so much from my colleagues in the research field is, well, what about research? We can't research. Oh, you could research. The federal government could do anything it damn well wants if it wants to. They could open up avenues for funding, for research, for allowing for research. Folks, let me tell you something. We got all these rules that say that we can't torture people, that we can't do this, that we can't fund bioweapons, that we can't. Guess what? Our federal government absolutely finds a way to do all of those things. You just don't know about it, or they don't tell you about it. If you really look, you'll see that they do. Okay? But the federal government could do practically anything that it wants. You don't think they could issue a waiver for research purposes for cannabis? They absolutely could. How do you think they experimented with that? LSD was something that the government was involved with. I mean, they were using it with the CIA. Amphetamines were something that were developed to help soldiers fight. In fact, many historians point to the Nazis and how fierce fighters they were, to their rampant abuse or administration of these same amphetamines that we're giving our kids now. So governments can do anything if we make them and we demand it. Yeah. So you can have your research. You could research out Schedule 3 thing.
That was a great point there. I'm gonna wrap it up here, Anthony. I'm out of shit. I want to thank you for being here. I'm gonna slap this up here one more time, Anthony Minniti. I'm gonna pull myself back up. You got any shameless plugs or shout outs that you want to do before we sign it off here? Fantastic chat, man. And I'll repost all this shit tomorrow.
No, I love it. Caleb, I want to thank you so much for having me as a guest. I love talking about this stuff. I'm passionate about this stuff. I know, as you said, I'm fine either way. You know, I'm doing this for all of us. I'm out there as a voice for all of us. My mother keeps telling me to shut the fuck up because I'm going to wind up like the Boeing people. I don't find myself to be that important. But if you have questions, you know, if things seem confusing to you, listen, reach out to me through LinkedIn. It's Anthony V. Minniti. You know, you can, my email is aminiti@bellpharmacycamden.com. You can get me right through the Bell Pharmacy Camden website. You can get me through the Camden Apothecary website. You can contact me. As you see, I have no shortage of words and love to talk, or maybe I just love to hear myself talk, I guess. But this stuff can get really deep into the weeds. And I can tell you that even though I'm not a degreed lawyer, I don't have a JD or from the bar, I have experience. So I don't need to read in a book how this all works, because I've lived it. I've done it, beginning to end. So in a lot of ways, that's better than studying a book. But I am here for all of you and for all of us. Feel free to reach out to me. You know, look, I get insulted on social media, something I'm very used to, because the one thing I found out in politics, just to show you, Gail, when I got into politics, there was no Facebook. The worst thing that somebody did was an angry letter to the editor, which seems so quaint these days. But in my years in politics, I found out the only area where I'm more deficient than looks is intelligence. So I've heard it all. But no, seriously, to all cannabis, I am here for you. anything I can do or answer in service to those of us who are building going forward, and out of respect to those who didn't make it here with us. I feel I have this responsibility to share this and to help everybody make the best decision possible.
Oh yeah, that's a great place to leave it right there. Anthony Minniti, great talk with you, man. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, and remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print. Peace.